You're just the cleaning lady. What could you possibly know about saving a company? Marcus Wellington sneered at the woman standing in his collapsing empire. She looked at the screens showing his ruin and said 5 words that froze his blood. I know who did this. Marcus Wellington had built his empire on one simple philosophy: trust no one, fear nothing, and never ever show weakness. At 43 years old, he stood at the pinnacle of the tech industry, owner of Wellington Cybersecurity Solutions, a company valued at $800 million. His office on the 67th floor of the Titanium Tower overlooked a city that seemed to exist solely to validate his success. Glass walls, minimalist furniture, and technology that responded to his voice alone. Everything in his world was designed to remind others of one undeniable fact. Marcus Wellington was untouchable. Until the morning everything disappeared. The screens that normally displayed his stock prices, international contracts, and security monitoring systems now showed only one message, repeated across every monitor in crimson letters. System breach complete. You have nothing left. Marcus stood frozen in the center of his office, his reflection multiplied in the glass walls around him. For the first time in 20 years of ruthless business practices, he felt something he'd forgotten existed: genuine fear. Mr. Wellington, his assistant Brandon Harris burst through the door, his professional composure completely shattered. Sir, it's catastrophic. Every account has been emptied. Every client contract has been deleted. Our backup systems, our security protocols, everything we've built, it's gone. Whoever did this didn't just hack us. They erased us. Marcus couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. Wellington Cybersecurity Solutions was supposed to be impenetrable. He'd hired the best engineers, the most brilliant minds in digital security. They'd protected governments, multinational corporations, intelligence agencies. How could someone have destroyed them so completely? The board is demanding an emergency meeting, Brandon continued, his voice shaking. Our clients are threatening lawsuits. The media already has the story. Mr. Wellington, they're calling it the biggest cybersecurity failure in corporate history. Get out, Marcus finally managed to whisper. Sir, we need to... I said, get out, Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Everyone out, now! Brandon retreated quickly, closing the door behind him. Marcus collapsed into his chair, staring at the screens that mocked him with their crimson message. 20 years of building, scheming, crushing competitors, sacrificing relationships, all of it gone in a single morning. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from board members, investors, journalists. He ignored them all. What could he possibly say? That Marcus Wellington, the man who'd built his reputation on being smarter than everyone else, had been outsmarted so thoroughly that he didn't even know how it had happened? The irony was suffocating. He'd made millions protecting others from exactly this kind of attack. Now he was the cautionary tale that would be taught in business schools for generations. Hours passed. Marcus sat motionless in his chair, watching the sun move across his office floor. His empire was burning, and he was paralyzed, unable to even begin understanding how to respond. A soft knock on the door interrupted his spiral of despair. I said I wanted to be alone. Marcus growled without turning around. I know, Mr. Wellington, a woman's voice responded quietly. But it's time for the evening cleaning. Marcus spun around, rage flooding through him like gasoline meeting flame. Standing in his doorway was Grace Thompson, the evening cleaning supervisor. She'd worked in this building for years, always arriving after business hours to clean the offices that people like Marcus dirtied during the day. He barely remembered her name, had never bothered learning anything about her beyond the fact that she emptied his trash and vacuumed his floors. Are you serious right now? Marcus's voice dripped with venom. My entire company just collapsed, and you're worried about cleaning my office? Grace stood calmly in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I understand you're having a difficult day, sir. But the building management requires all offices to be cleaned on schedule. A difficult day? Marcus laughed, a sound that bordered on hysteria. A difficult day? I just lost everything. $800 million gone. My reputation destroyed, my life's work erased, and you're standing there talking to me about cleaning schedules? I apologize for the intrusion, Grace said, her voice remaining steady despite his outburst. "I'll come back later." She turned to leave, but something in Marcus snapped. The rage, the humiliation, the absolute helplessness he felt needed a target, and she was there. "You know what's funny?" Marcus stood up, his voice taking on a cruel edge. "People like you will never understand what people like me go through. You push a mop around floors, empty trash cans, and go home. No pressure, no responsibility, no consequences. Must be nice living such a simple life." Grace stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. "You have no idea what it's like to build something real," Marcus continued, the words pouring out like poison. "To create jobs, to innovate, to operate at the highest levels of business. You just exist, doing menial work that anyone could do. No education required, no intelligence needed. Just show up and clean." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Marcus immediately felt a twinge of something. Not quite guilt, but an awareness that he'd crossed a line. But his pride wouldn't let him take it back. He'd spent his entire career believing that success justified any behavior, that being right about business gave him permission to be wrong about humanity. Grace turned slowly, and for the first time, Marcus actually looked at her. Really looked. She was probably in her 40s, with an expression that suggested she'd heard variations of his speech many times before. But there was something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. Not anger, but something closer to pity. "You're right, Mr. Wellington," Grace said quietly. "I don't know what it's like to build an $800 million company. I've never operated at your level of business." Marcus felt a surge of vindication. At least someone was finally acknowledging his superiority, even in the midst of his catastrophe. "But I do know something about what happened to you today," Grace continued, and her voice changed, became sharper, more focused. "I know exactly what happened to your company." Marcus blinked, confused. "What?" "The system breach, the complete erasure of your data, the sophistication of the attack that bypassed every security protocol you'd installed." Grace stepped back into the office, and suddenly the dynamic in the room shifted in a way Marcus couldn't quite understand. "I know who did it. I know how they did it. And I know why." The room seemed to tilt. Marcus stared at this woman he'd just finished insulting, trying to process what she'd said. "That's impossible. How could you possibly know anything about advanced cybersecurity?" Grace finished his sentence. "Because you assumed that someone who cleans offices for a living couldn't possibly understand anything complex. That's the same assumption that made your security vulnerable in the first place." Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This had to be a joke, some kind of cruel prank in the worst moment of his life. "You expect me to believe that you, a cleaning lady, understand a sophisticated cyber attack that my $1 million security team couldn't prevent?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Grace replied calmly. "But I've been cleaning this building for 8 years. I've emptied trash cans in every tech company on every floor. I've seen documents that were supposed to be shredded but weren't. I've overheard conversations that people assumed I was too simple to understand. I've watched your company and a dozen others operate with the kind of arrogance that always, eventually, becomes a vulnerability." She walked to his desk and looked at the screen still displaying the crimson message. "The breach came from inside your company, Mr. Wellington. Someone you trusted completely. Someone who understood your security systems intimately because you gave them access to everything. Someone who knew that your greatest weakness wasn't your technology. It was your absolute certainty that you were smarter than everyone around you." Marcus felt dizzy. Who did this?" Grace turned to look at him, and in her eyes was a knowledge that terrified him more than the breach itself. "The question isn't who did this to you, Mr. Wellington. The question is, are you ready to hear the truth? Because once I tell you, everything you think you know about your company, your employees, and yourself will change forever." "Tell me," Marcus demanded, his voice hoarse. "If you really know something, tell me right now." "Not yet," Grace said, picking up her cleaning cart. "First, you need to decide something. Are you going to keep treating me like I'm invisible? Like I'm too stupid to matter? Or are you going to recognize that sometimes the people you've spent your life looking down on are the only ones who can see clearly enough to save you?" "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're playing games while my life is falling apart." "I'm giving you a choice," Grace corrected. "Tomorrow morning, if you're ready to listen, really listen, Come to the Riverside Community Center on Market Street, 7 o'clock. I'll tell you everything you need to know. But Mr. Wellington, you need to come alone, and you need to leave your arrogance at the door. Because the people who destroyed you are counting on you being too proud to ask for help from someone like me." She pushed her cart toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. The attack isn't finished. What you saw today was just the beginning. In 3 days, they're going to release something that will destroy what's left of your reputation permanently. Unless you're willing to learn the truth from someone you've spent your career considering beneath you." Grace left the office, the soft sound of her cartwheels fading down the hallway. Marcus stood alone among his screens of failure, his mind reeling. Every instinct told him this was nonsense, that a cleaning lady couldn't possibly know anything useful about sophisticated cybercrime. But a small voice in the back of his mind, the part of him that had survived in business by recognizing opportunities others missed, whispered something different. What if she was telling the truth? What if his complete dismissal of people like Grace was exactly the blindness that had led to his destruction? Marcus looked at his reflection in the dark windows, seeing a man he barely recognized, humiliated, desperate, and for the first time in his life, completely uncertain about his own judgment. The sun had set completely now. The city lights below glittered like stars that existed in a universe he no longer controlled. Marcus Wellington, who had trusted no one and feared nothing, now faced a choice that terrified him more than any business decision he'd ever made. Tomorrow morning, would he swallow his pride and visit a community center to listen to a cleaning lady? Or would he cling to his arrogance and face whatever destruction was coming in 3 days? The crimson message still glowed on his screens. You have nothing left. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely true. Maybe he had one thing left, the opportunity to become someone different than the man who'd lost everything. The question was whether his pride would let him take it. Marcus Wellington didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse apartment surrounded by the artifacts of his success. Awards, framed magazine covers with his face, photographs of him shaking hands with presidents and tech moguls. Every object in the room was a monument to his superiority, his brilliance, his absolute certainty that he'd earned his place above everyone else. Now they all felt like tombstones. At 6:30 in the morning, he found himself standing in front of his bathroom mirror, trying to recognize the man staring back. The confident CEO who'd never questioned his own judgment was gone. In his place stood someone Marcus had never allowed himself to be. Vulnerable. The Riverside Community Center on Market Street. 7 o'clock. The address felt like a punchline to a cruel joke. Marcus Wellington, who'd given keynote speeches at international conferences, who'd been interviewed by major news networks, who'd advised Fortune 500 companies on security, he was supposed to seek help at a community center from a woman who cleaned offices? Everything in him screamed to ignore Grace's offer, to call his lawyers, his remaining board members, to handle this crisis the way he'd handled every other problem in his life, with money, power, and the absolute conviction that he knew better than everyone else. But that approach had left him with nothing. And in 3 days, according to Grace, whatever remained of his reputation would be destroyed permanently. At 6:45, Marcus made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. He left his penthouse, climbed into his car, and drove toward a part of the city he'd never visited, to meet someone he'd spent his career dismissing as irrelevant. The Riverside Community Center was nothing like the gleaming towers where Marcus normally conducted business. It was a modest building, clearly decades old, with community notices posted on boards outside and the sound of children's voices echoing from somewhere within. The parking lot held aging vehicles that told stories of people working multiple jobs just to survive. The kind of people Marcus had always considered background noise in his success story. He parked his luxury sedan and immediately felt exposed, like an imposter who'd wandered into the wrong world. Several people entering the building glanced at him curiously, and Marcus realized with uncomfortable clarity that he stood out here in ways he never had in boardrooms. Inside, the community center was warm and lived in, with mismatched furniture and walls covered in children's artwork and announcements for job training programs, food assistance, and English classes. It smelled like coffee and something baking, nothing like the sterile perfection of his corporate offices. "Mr. Wellington," Grace's voice came from a doorway to his left. You came." She sounded genuinely surprised, and Marcus felt a flash of his old defensiveness. Did she really think he was so proud that he'd choose destruction over survival? But looking at her now, in this environment, Marcus saw something he'd missed in his office. Grace belonged here in a way that suggested this place was more than just a location. It was a community, a world that had existed and thrived completely outside his awareness. "You said 7 o'clock, Marcus replied, his voice stiffer than he intended. "I'm here. Follow me." Grace led him down a hallway to a small room set up with basic tables and chairs. On one table sat a laptop, not the expensive equipment Marcus was accustomed to, but functional. "We can talk privately here." They sat across from each other, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus realized he had no idea how to begin this conversation. In his world, he'd always controlled every interaction, set every agenda. Here, he was completely adrift. "Before I tell you what I know," Grace began, "I need to understand something. Why did you come? Was it desperation or was it something else?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "Does it matter? You said you knew who destroyed my company. I need that information." "It matters," Grace said firmly, "because what I'm about to tell you will only help if you're capable of hearing it. And hearing it requires you to accept that everything you believed about how the world works might be wrong." Marcus felt irritation rising. "I didn't come here for philosophy lessons. I came for information." "Then you've already wasted your time," Grace stood up. "Because the information without the wisdom to use it properly is worthless. Your attackers are counting on that." "Wait," Marcus said quickly, hating how desperate he sounded. "I'm sorry. I'm listening. Really listening." Grace studied him for a long moment, then sat back down. "The person who destroyed your company is someone named Dylan Foster. Does that name mean anything to you?" Marcus searched his memory. "Foster. Dylan Foster. He was an intern we had years ago. Brilliant kid, fresh out of university. But he left after a few months. I barely remember him." "He remembers you," Grace said quietly. "Very clearly. Do you recall why he left?" Marcus tried to remember, but the truth was he'd never paid attention to interns unless they did something spectacular. They were temporary workers, replaceable, barely worth noticing. "I have no idea. People come and go all the time in tech companies." Dylan Foster came to Wellington Cybersecurity with a revolutionary idea for a new security protocol. Grace opened her laptop and pulled up documents that made Marcus's eyes widen. "He presented it to you in a meeting. You told him it was interesting but needed work. Then you had your lead developer, Stephen Park, refine it and implement it as the foundation of your most profitable product line." The memory crashed back into Marcus's consciousness like a physical blow. He did remember now. A nervous young intern with a laptop full of diagrams, explaining an encryption system that Marcus had immediately recognized as valuable. He'd thanked the kid, sent him away, and then he'd done what he always did. Taken the idea, improved it with his experienced team, and built an empire on it without ever crediting the original source. That's standard practice in the industry," Marcus said weakly. "Interns sign agreements. Their work belongs to the company." "His work belonged to the company," Grace agreed. "But what about his dignity? What about acknowledgement? What about the career he could have built if you'd given him credit for revolutionizing cybersecurity? Instead, Dylan Foster left your company with nothing. No recognition, no recommendations, nothing but the knowledge that his brilliance had been stolen by someone who saw him as too insignificant to matter." Marcus felt sick. People pitch ideas all the time. "We can't credit every—" "Dylan Foster wasn't just people," Grace interrupted. "He was a young man with extraordinary talent who made the mistake of trusting someone he admired. You were his hero, Mr. Wellington. He'd followed your career, read your interviews, dreamed of learning from you, and you treated him like a resource to be extracted and discarded." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He'd built his entire self-image on being a visionary, a creator, a man who'd earned his success through superior intelligence. Now he was being confronted with the reality that one of his greatest successes had been built on someone else's foundation, someone he'd dismissed as too unimportant to even remember properly. "Where is he now?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "That's the interesting part." Grace pulled up more documents. After leaving your company, Dylan couldn't get hired anywhere in the industry. Your lead developer, Stephen Park, apparently told other companies that Dylan was difficult to work with, that his ideas were derivative. Dylan spent years working low-level jobs, watching you build billions on his innovation, while his own career died before it started. Stephen told other companies. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him. Stephen Park has been with me for 15 years. He's my most trusted executive. Is he? Grace turned the laptop toward Marcus. Look at these financial records. For the past 3 years, Stephen has been systematically moving money from your company into offshore accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger. He's been preparing for this for a long time. Marcus stared at the documents, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Stephen Park, the man he'd promoted repeatedly, trusted with his most sensitive projects, considered almost a partner. Stephen had been stealing from him? But why? Marcus whispered. I paid him extremely well. He had equity in the company. Why would he? Because you never saw him as a person, Grace said softly. You saw him as a tool, someone useful who could refine other people's ideas and make you money. Stephen watched you take credit for work that was often partially his. He watched you humiliate employees who questioned you. He watched you build a reputation as a genius while treating everyone around you as inferior. So he teamed up with Dylan Foster for revenge? Marcus was struggling to keep up. Not revenge, Grace corrected. Justice. In Dylan's mind, he's simply taking back what was always his, the recognition, the success, the empire that should have been built on his acknowledged contribution. And Stephen is his partner because Stephen finally decided that if you were going to treat him as disposable, he might as well profit from his disposal. Marcus pushed away from the table, his legs barely supporting him as he stood. This couldn't be real. His entire world had been built on lies he'd told himself about his own superiority, his own genius. And now it was all crumbling because he'd never bothered to see the humanity in the people he'd used to build his empire. How do you know all this? Marcus turned to Grace, suddenly suspicious. How could you possibly have access to this information? Are you working with them? Grace smiled sadly. No, Mr. Wellington. I'm not working with them. But I told you, I've spent 8 years cleaning offices in that building. I've seen documents, overheard conversations, noticed patterns. And unlike you, I pay attention to the people everyone else ignores. What people? The security guards who chat during night shifts, the IT workers who complain about suspicious activity but get ignored by management, the administrative assistants who notice their bosses having secret meetings, the janitorial staff who empty trash cans containing documents that were supposed to be shredded. Grace stood up. You've spent your career dismissing people in service positions as invisible. But we see everything, Mr. Wellington. We hear everything. We're just trained not to matter. Marcus felt tears stinging his eyes, something he couldn't remember experiencing since childhood. Why are you helping me? After how I treated you? After how I've treated people like you my entire life? Why would you help me? Because someone helped me once, Grace said quietly. Years ago, I was in a situation not unlike Dylan Foster's. I had talent that was stolen, dreams that were crushed by someone who saw me as disposable. And when I was at my lowest, a stranger showed me kindness I didn't deserve. They taught me that the cycle of cruelty only breaks when someone chooses compassion over revenge. She walked to the window, looking out at the community center's courtyard where children were playing. Dylan Foster and Stephen Park believe they're pursuing justice, but really they're pursuing revenge. And revenge just creates more victims. If I can stop that cycle, even if it means helping someone who doesn't deserve it, then maybe I can honor the kindness that was once shown to me. Marcus collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands. What happens in 3 days? You said they're planning to release something. Video and audio recordings, Grace said. Every insulting comment you've ever made to employees. Every time you've taken credit for someone else's work. Every humiliating interaction you've had with service staff. Dylan has been collecting them for years, waiting for the perfect moment. He's going to release them publicly, probably to major news outlets and social media. Your reputation won't just be damaged, it'll be destroyed permanently. Can we stop it? Possibly, Grace said. But not by fighting them legally or with money or power. Those are the tools that got you into this situation. If you want to stop this, you're going to have to do something you've never done before. What? Tell the truth, Grace said simply. Acknowledge what you did. Take responsibility. Apologize not just with words, but with actions.
Show Dylan and Stephen and everyone watching that people can change, that success built on arrogance can be rebuilt on humility. Marcus laughed bitterly. You're asking me to destroy myself publicly. No, Grace corrected. I'm asking you to destroy the version of yourself that deserves to be destroyed. The arrogant, cruel man who built an empire on other people's backs. What comes after? That's up to you.
The room fell silent. Outside, Marcus could hear the sounds of the community center coming to life. People arriving for morning programs, volunteers setting up for the day's activities. A world of purpose and connection that he'd never known existed. I don't know how to be someone different, Marcus said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Then it's time you learned, Grace replied. And lucky for you, you've got 3 days before Dylan's deadline. That's 3 days to start becoming someone worth saving. Marcus looked at this woman who cleaned offices, who he'd dismissed as beneath his notice, who was now offering him the only lifeline he had. And for the first time in his life, he realized that wisdom and intelligence weren't the same as wealth and status. That the people he'd spent his career looking down on might actually be the ones who understood humanity better than he ever had. Teach me, Marcus said, the words feeling like surrender and liberation at the same time. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm willing to learn. Grace smiled, a genuine smile that held no mockery, only hope. Then we start tomorrow. But first, there's someone you need to meet. Someone who can help you understand what you've really lost and what you might still be able to save. Who? Her name is Patricia Chen, Grace said. She was your administrative assistant 3 years ago. You fired her for a mistake that wasn't her fault. She's the one who first noticed Stephen Park's suspicious activities. But when she tried to tell you, you dismissed her as paranoid and let her go. Marcus closed his eyes, another memory surfacing. Patricia. Smart, dedicated, always prepared. He'd fired her because she'd questioned one of Stephen's financial decisions, and Stephen was his trusted executive. Marcus had chosen to believe Stephen over Patricia without even investigating. She works here now, Grace continued, teaching computer literacy to adults who are trying to improve their lives. She could have become bitter, could have walked away from technology entirely. Instead, she chose to use her skills to help others. If you want to learn how to rebuild your life, she's the one who can show you how. As Marcus left the community center that morning, his luxury sedan felt like a costume from a play he no longer understood. He drove through streets he'd never really seen before, past people whose lives had existed in parallel to his own, without ever intersecting with his consciousness. Everything had changed. In 48 hours, he would either find a way to transform himself genuinely, or he would watch the final destruction of everything he'd built on foundations of arrogance and cruelty. For the first time in his life, Marcus Wellington understood that the most important battle he'd ever face wasn't about money or power or reputation. It was about whether he could become someone worthy of redemption. The following morning, Marcus found himself standing outside a classroom in the Riverside Community Center, watching through a window as Patricia Chen taught a group of adults how to navigate spreadsheet software. He recognized her immediately, the efficient assistant who'd always anticipated his needs, who'd kept his calendar organized, who he'd fired without a second thought because she dared question Stephen Park's financial decisions. Patricia moved around the classroom with patient energy, helping a woman in her 50s understand formulas, encouraging a young man struggling with basic functions. There was no trace of bitterness in her expressions, no hint of the career destruction Marcus had casually inflicted on her. Grace appeared beside him. She's been teaching here for 2 years, 3 nights a week, plus weekend sessions. Most of her students are people trying to re-enter the workforce after setbacks, immigrants rebuilding their careers, parents returning after raising children, formerly incarcerated individuals seeking second chances. People I would have dismissed as irrelevant, Marcus said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. People you did dismiss as irrelevant, Grace corrected gently. Patricia could have gone to work for your competitors, could have used what she knew about your company to damage you years ago. Instead, she chose to help others. That's the difference between revenge and redemption. When the class ended, Patricia noticed them through the window. Her expression flickered, surprise, then something harder to read. She spoke briefly to her students, then approached the hallway where Marcus and Grace waited. "Mr. Wellington," Patricia said, her voice professionally neutral. "Grace told me you might visit. I wasn't certain you would." Marcus opened his mouth to offer some practiced business greeting, then stopped himself. Everything he'd learned to say in corporate environments felt false here, inadequate for the conversation he needed to have. "I'm sorry," he said instead, the words raw and unpracticed, "for firing you, for not listening to you about Stephen, for destroying your career because I was too arrogant to consider that you might be right and I might be wrong." Patricia studied him for a long moment. "Do you even remember why I questioned Stephen's financial decisions?" Marcus searched his memory, coming up empty. "I remember you said something about irregular transfers. I thought you were being paranoid. There were 7 transactions over 2 months that didn't match our normal accounting patterns," Patricia said. "Small amounts, always to different consulting firms that I couldn't verify actually existed. I spent 3 weeks investigating on my own time before bringing it to you. I had documentation, evidence, questions that needed answers. And I dismissed you without looking at any of it," Marcus finished, the memory returning with painful clarity now. He'd been preparing for a major presentation, had been irritated by the interruption, had trusted Stephen absolutely. "I told you that you didn't understand high-level financial strategy and that you should focus on your actual job. You told me that administrative assistants shouldn't pretend to understand business decisions that were beyond their comprehension," Patricia corrected, her voice still level but with an edge of old pain. "Then you fired me for creating unnecessary conflict and spreading rumors about senior executives." Grace put a hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Tell him what happened after." Patricia took a deep breath. "Stephen Park made certain I couldn't get another job in the tech industry. He called contacts at other companies, told them I was unstable, that I'd made false accusations against management. My reputation was destroyed. I had student loans, rent, and suddenly no income and no prospects." Marcus felt physically sick. "Patricia, I'm not finished," Patricia interrupted firmly. "I spent 6 months applying to hundreds of positions. Nothing. I worked retail, food service, anything to survive. I watched my savings disappear, watched opportunities I'd worked years to build just evaporate. All because I'd noticed something suspicious and tried to do the right thing." "How did you end up here?" Marcus asked, though part of him didn't want to know, didn't want to face more evidence of the destruction he'd caused. "A woman named Dorothy Jackson," Patricia said, and her expression softened. "She volunteered here, teaching resume writing. I came to one of her workshops, desperate and bitter. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself anymore. She encouraged me to start teaching basic computer skills to others who were struggling. Said that sometimes helping others find their way is how you find your own." Grace smiled. "Dorothy was the person who helped me years ago, the one I told you about. She's the reason this community center has so many programs for people rebuilding their lives. She believed that everyone deserves a second chance, including people who've made terrible mistakes." "Where is she now?" Marcus asked. "I'd like to meet her, to thank her for—" "She passed away last year," Patricia said softly. "Cancer. But before she died, she made us all promise something. She said, 'Don't let cruelty win. When someone who's been cruel comes to you broken, you have a choice. Push them down further, or show them there's another way.' She believed that most people are cruel because they're scared and lost, not because they're evil." Marcus felt tears threatening again. "I don't deserve this. Any of this. The help, the compassion. After what I did to both of you." "You're right," Patricia said bluntly. "You don't deserve it. But Dorothy taught us that redemption isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. So here's what's going to happen, Mr. Wellington. I'm going to help you, not because you deserve it, but because refusing to help would make me just another person choosing cruelty over compassion." She gestured toward the classroom. "Come inside. We need to talk about Dylan Foster and what you're really facing." The classroom was simple. Folding tables, basic computers, whiteboards covered with notes about job applications and interview skills. Marcus sat in a student's chair, feeling completely out of place, yet strangely appropriate. He'd spent decades teaching others from positions of authority. Now, he was the student, and the lesson was about his own moral bankruptcy. Patricia opened her laptop and pulled up a series of documents. Dylan Foster didn't just hack your company, Mr. Wellington. He built a comprehensive case documenting every unethical practice Wellington cybersecurity has engaged in over the past decade. Patent violations, idea theft, employee exploitation, wage suppression, hostile work environments, all meticulously documented. Marcus stared at the screen, seeing years of decisions that he'd justified as business necessity laid out as evidence of systematic abuse. How did he get all this? The same way Grace gets information, Patricia explained. By paying attention to the people you ignore. IT workers who notice unusual access patterns. Administrative staff who overhear conversations and see documents. Janitorial services who empty trash containing sensitive materials. All the invisible people in your company who watch you operate and remember everything. Stephen Park has been feeding Dylan information for 3 years, Grace added. Every unethical decision, every questionable practice. Stephen documented it all, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy you completely. But why wait 3 years? Marcus asked. If they wanted revenge, why not release everything immediately? Patricia smiled grimly. Because Dylan Foster isn't stupid. He's methodical. He wanted to make sure the destruction was absolute. First, he hacked your systems and stole your wealth. Now he's going to release documentation that will destroy your reputation and likely result in legal consequences. Criminal charges for fraud, civil suits from former employees, regulatory investigations. By the time he's finished, you won't just be poor, you'll be in prison. The classroom felt like it was tilting. Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Can we stop it? Legal action? Injunctions? That's your old thinking, Patricia interrupted. Trying to use power and money to solve problems created by power and money. That approach is exactly what Dylan is counting on. He wants you to fight legally so he can expose more corruption during discovery. He wants you to threaten him so he can position himself as a whistleblower fighting corporate evil. Every typical response you might take will just make things worse. Then what do I do? Marcus heard the desperation in his own voice. You do what Dorothy taught us, Grace said. You tell the truth, publicly, completely. Before Dylan releases his documentation, you acknowledge what you've done, take full responsibility, and commit to making genuine amends. That's corporate suicide. Yes, Patricia agreed. It's suicide for the Marcus Wellington who built an empire on other people's backs. But it might be survival for the Marcus Wellington who wants to become someone different. The question is, which version of yourself do you want to save? Marcus stood up, pacing the small classroom. Everything in him screamed that this was insane, that admitting fault publicly would destroy any chance he had of rebuilding. But a quieter voice, one he'd suppressed his entire career, whispered that maybe destruction was exactly what he needed. There's something else you need to know, Patricia said, pulling up another document. Dylan Foster isn't working alone anymore. He's recruited 17 former Wellington cybersecurity employees, people you fired, people you humiliated, people whose careers you damaged. They're planning a coordinated media campaign to coincide with the document release. Television interviews, social media, everything. You won't just be facing one whistleblower. You'll be facing a chorus of voices telling stories of corporate abuse. 17 people, Marcus whispered. I destroyed 17 people's lives enough that they'd dedicate years to destroying mine? At least 17, Grace corrected. Those are just the ones who joined Dylan's campaign. There are dozens more who chose to rebuild their lives quietly, who decided that revenge wasn't worth the energy. But 17 felt wounded deeply enough that they're willing to relive their trauma publicly, just to see you face consequences. Marcus collapsed back into the student chair, his head in his hands. The magnitude of his cruelty, laid out so clearly, was suffocating. He'd spent his career thinking of himself as a visionary leader, a genius entrepreneur. Now he saw himself as others saw him, a systematic destroyer of human dignity, someone who'd built success on a foundation of other people's pain. I don't know how to fix this, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been. Then it's time to learn, Patricia said, but her voice was gentler now. Dorothy used to say that transformation starts with 3 steps. First, you have to see yourself clearly. Not the story you tell yourself, but the truth of what you've become. Second, you have to accept responsibility without excuses. And third, You have to take concrete action to repair harm, even knowing it may never be enough. How did she know all this? Marcus asked. This Dorothy who helped both of you? Grace and Patricia exchanged a look. Dorothy was in prison for 8 years, Grace said quietly. White-collar crime. She'd been a successful executive who'd committed fraud to cover up mistakes. She lost everything. Her career, her family, her freedom. But in prison, she chose to become someone different. When she got out, she dedicated her life to helping others avoid the path she'd taken. She helped people who'd hurt her? Marcus was struggling to understand. She helped people who were hurting, Patricia corrected. She believed that most cruelty comes from people who are suffering and don't know how to process it except by inflicting it on others. She'd been cruel because she was terrified of failure, of being seen as weak. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Marcus had spent his entire career terrified, of being challenged, of being proven wrong, of someone discovering that maybe he wasn't the genius everyone believed he was. So he'd surrounded himself with people he could dominate, dismissed anyone who questioned him, and built walls of arrogance to protect his fragile ego. What was her last name? Marcus asked. Dorothy's full name? Dorothy Jackson, Grace replied. Why? Because I want to research her, understand her story. If she could transform after what she'd done, maybe. Marcus trailed off, afraid to finish the sentence, afraid to hope. Maybe you can too, Patricia finished for him. But Marcus, can I call you Marcus? He nodded. But, Marcus, you need to understand something. Dorothy's transformation took years. She worked every day to become someone different. She failed constantly, backslid into old patterns, frustrated people who were trying to help her. Redemption isn't a decision you make once. It's a choice you make every single day, sometimes every single hour. I have 3 days, Marcus said. Dylan releases his documentation in 3 days. That's not enough time to transform. No, Grace agreed. But it's enough time to start. It's enough time to take the first genuine step. And sometimes, the first genuine step is more powerful than 1,000 polished performances. Patricia pulled up a calendar on her laptop. Here's what we're proposing. Tomorrow, you're going to start reaching out to people you've hurt. Not all of them, there isn't time, but key people. You're going to apologize, sincerely and without excuses. You're going to listen to their stories without defending yourself. And you're going to ask them what meaningful amends might look like. Will anyone even talk to me? Some will, some won't, Patricia said. But the ones who do will be the first evidence that you're serious about changing. And Grace and I will be with you, helping you understand when you're falling into old patterns, when your apologies are genuine versus when they're manipulative. Why? Marcus looked between these two women who owed him nothing but cruelty, who had every right to watch his destruction with satisfaction. Why are you doing this? Because Dorothy asked us to, Grace said simply. Before she died, she made us promise that if someone came to us genuinely broken and seeking change, we'd give them the chance she'd been given. She said, cruelty is a disease that spreads through society. Compassion is the cure. But the cure only works if someone is willing to administer it, even to people who don't deserve it. Patricia closed her laptop. Tomorrow morning we start. But tonight, Marcus, I want you to do something. I want you to go home and make a list of every person you can remember hurting, dismissing, or damaging. Don't filter it. Don't justify it. Just write down names and what you did. Be honest with yourself in a way you've never been before. That list could be pages long, Marcus said. Then it will be pages long, Patricia replied. But until you see the full scope of what you've done, you can't begin to address it. And Marcus, this is going to hurt. Confronting your own cruelty in detail is one of the most painful things a person can do, but it's also the only way to stop being cruel. As Marcus left the community center that afternoon, the city looked different to him again. He noticed people he'd never paid attention to before. The custodian emptying trash, the security guard at his building entrance, the administrative assistants rushing between offices. Each one a complete person with dreams, struggles, dignity. Each one someone he'd probably dismissed at some point as irrelevant to his success story. That night, in his penthouse apartment, Marcus sat with a notebook and began writing names. Patricia Chen, Dylan Foster, Stephen Park. No, Stephen was a villain, But Marcus had created the conditions that turned him into one. Grace Thompson, Brandon Harris. How many times had he humiliated his assistant in front of others? The list grew. An intern he'd mocked for a presentation mistake. An executive who disagreed with him and been fired publicly. Administrative staff whose names he'd never learned. Security personnel he'd treated as invisible. Vendors he'd bullied on contracts. Competitors he'd destroyed through questionable practices. By midnight, Marcus had filled 17 pages with names and actions. Some memories were clear, others fuzzy. But each one represented a moment when he'd chosen cruelty over kindness, dominance over dignity, his ego over someone else's humanity. He stared at the pages, tears streaming down his face. This was who he'd been. This was the legacy he'd built alongside his financial empire. A mountain of human wreckage, people whose lives he'd damaged or destroyed in service of his own success and ego. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of apologizing, of taking responsibility, of trying to repair harm that might be irreparable. And in 2 days, Dylan Foster would release documentation that would destroy what remained of Marcus Wellington's reputation and freedom. But for the first time in his life, Marcus understood that losing his reputation and freedom might be exactly the price his transformation required. Dorothy Jackson had gone to prison and come out someone different. Maybe Marcus Wellington would have to do the same. The question was whether he could become someone different before the consequences of who he'd been destroyed him completely. The morning sun hadn't fully risen when Marcus arrived at Grace's modest apartment in a neighborhood he'd driven past 1,000 times but never truly seen. The building was weathered but well-maintained, with flower boxes in windows and children's bicycles chained to railings. Grace answered the door in casual attire, holding a cup of coffee and looking unsurprised by his early arrival. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, stepping aside to let him enter. "I kept reading the list," Marcus admitted, holding up the 17 pages he'd filled the night before. "Every name felt like a weight pressing on my chest. I don't know how I lived with myself carrying all this." "You didn't live with it," Grace said, leading him to a small kitchen table. "You built walls around it, told yourself stories about why your actions were justified. That's what people do when confronting the truth feels too painful." Patricia arrived minutes later, carrying a folder stuffed with documents. "I've been doing research," she said, spreading papers across the table. "I identified 7 people from your list who live locally and might be willing to meet with you. 7 opportunities to practice apologizing genuinely." Marcus looked at the names Patricia had highlighted. Thomas Rivera, a software engineer he'd publicly berated in a meeting before firing him. Jennifer Okonkwo, an administrative coordinator whose idea he'd stolen and presented as his own. Michael Chen, no relation to Patricia, a security analyst who'd reported concerns about Stephen Park's access privileges and been dismissed as paranoid. "These are people whose lives I ruined," Marcus said quietly. "Why would any of them agree to see me?" "Because Grace and I reached out to them," Patricia explained. "We explained that you're attempting genuine transformation, that Dorothy's philosophy was guiding this process. Some refused immediately, but these 7 said they'd consider meeting you, though they made no promises about forgiveness or even civility." "When do we start?" "Now," Grace said. "Thomas Rivera agreed to meet at Riverside Cafe in an hour. He was the engineer you fired for questioning your decision to release software with known security vulnerabilities. Do you remember him?" Marcus searched his memory, and the scene came back with painful clarity. A team meeting, Thomas standing up with concern in his voice, explaining why rushing the product launch could endanger client data. Marcus had exploded at him, accused him of being a coward who lacked vision, fired him in front of the entire development team as an example of what happened to people who questioned leadership. "I remember," Marcus said, feeling sick. "I fired him because he was right, and I couldn't admit I'd made a mistake." "The product launched with vulnerabilities," Patricia added. 3 months later, a client was hacked. You blamed the security team and fired 2 more people. But the root cause was exactly what Thomas had warned about. The Riverside Cafe was a neighborhood establishment that had probably been serving the community for decades. Local artwork covered the walls, and the staff greeted regulars by name. Marcus felt completely out of place in his expensive suit, surrounded by people whose authenticity made his carefully constructed persona feel like a costume. Thomas Rivera sat at a corner table, and Marcus recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed. He looked older, worn in ways that suggested life had been difficult since Wellington cybersecurity. When Thomas saw Marcus approach with Grace and Patricia flanking him, his expression hardened. "Mr. Rivera," Marcus began, his voice catching, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "I didn't agree for you," Thomas said bluntly, not standing or offering to shake hands. "I agreed because Patricia Chen is someone I respect, and she asked me to give you an opportunity. But understand something. You destroyed my career. You humiliated me publicly, then made certain I couldn't get hired anywhere in the industry, so whatever you came to say, make it quick." Marcus sat down, Grace and Patricia taking chairs at a nearby table to give them space, but remaining close enough to observe. Every instinct Marcus had developed over decades of business told him to defend himself, to explain the context, to minimize his actions. He fought against those instincts with everything he had. "You were right," Marcus said simply, "about the security vulnerabilities, about the risks of rushing the launch, about everything. And I fired you not because you were wrong, but because I couldn't handle being challenged. I prioritized my ego over client security, and when people were harmed by that decision, I blamed others instead of taking responsibility." Thomas stared at him, clearly not expecting such a direct admission. "Do you have any idea what you did to my life? I'd worked in tech for 15 years. I had a mortgage, a family, a reputation. You didn't just fire me. You told everyone in the industry that I was disloyal and difficult to work with. No one would hire me. I lost my house. My marriage fell apart from the financial stress. I ended up working warehouse jobs just to survive." Each word was like a physical blow. Marcus felt tears forming but didn't wipe them away. "I'm sorry. Those words aren't adequate, but they're all I have. You did nothing wrong. Everything that happened to you was a direct result of my arrogance and cruelty, and I don't have any right to ask for your forgiveness." "You're right," Thomas said, his voice hard. "You don't. So why are you here? Guilty conscience now that your own empire has collapsed?" "Yes," Marcus admitted, "and because I'm trying to become someone different, someone who doesn't destroy lives to protect his ego. I know an apology can't undo the damage I caused, but I wanted you to hear, directly from me, that what happened to you was entirely my fault and completely unjust." Thomas was silent for a long moment, studying Marcus's face as if searching for deception. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Marcus said honestly. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or absolution. I'm here to acknowledge the truth and to ask what, if anything, I could do that might represent meaningful amends." "You can't give me back the years I lost," Thomas said. "You can't repair my marriage or restore my reputation. What you did is permanent." "I know. But," Thomas continued, his voice softening slightly, "there are other engineers like me, people who got pushed out of the industry for speaking truth to power. Maybe instead of apologizing to me, you could actually do something useful. Create opportunities for people like us. Fund programs that help whistleblowers and people who've been blacklisted for ethical stands." Marcus pulled out a notebook. "Tell me more." They talked for another hour. Thomas explained the challenges faced by ethical professionals who'd been pushed out of industries for refusing to compromise. He described support networks that existed but were underfunded, job placement programs that could help people rebuild technical careers. Marcus took notes on everything, asking questions not to defend himself, but to genuinely understand. When they finally stood to leave, Thomas extended his hand. "I don't forgive you," he said bluntly. "Maybe I never will. But if you actually follow through on creating those programs, if you help even one person avoid what I went through, then maybe something good can come from all the bad you caused." The next meeting was harder. Jennifer Okonkwo agreed to meet at her home, a small house in a working-class neighborhood where she lived with her 3 children. When Marcus arrived with Grace and Patricia, Jennifer met them at the door with an expression that mixed anger and exhaustion. "I have 30 minutes before I need to leave for my second job," Jennifer said, not inviting them past the doorway. "Say what you came to say." DeMarcus had practiced this apology during the drive over, but standing in front of Jennifer with her children's voices echoing from inside the house, all his prepared words felt inadequate. 6 years ago, you presented an idea for streamlining client data management, Marcus began. You'd worked on it for months on your own time, created a detailed proposal. I told you it was interesting but needed refinement. Then I took your idea, had my development team implement it, and presented it as my innovation. You confronted me about it, and I fired you for insubordination. I remember, Jennifer said coldly. That system generated millions in efficiency savings. You got credit for revolutionizing data management. I got unemployment and a reputation as a troublemaker. It was your idea entirely, Marcus said. You deserved credit, compensation, promotion. Instead, I stole your work and punished you for challenging me. What I did was theft, plain and simple. And I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't feed my children, Jennifer said. Sorry doesn't give me back the career I lost or the opportunities that disappeared. I was working toward management before you fired me. Now I work 2 jobs just to make rent, and I'm still paying off debt from when I couldn't find work. What would meaningful amends look like? Marcus asked. I can't undo the past, but I want to take responsibility for the financial harm I caused. Jennifer laughed bitterly. You think money fixes this? You think writing a check makes you feel better about what you did? No, Marcus said quietly. But I think financial restitution acknowledges that what I did had concrete consequences. You lost income, opportunities, career trajectory. Money won't heal the emotional wounds, but it might address some of the practical damage. Jennifer was silent, her eyes searching Marcus's face. If you're serious, she said finally, then here's what I want. Full compensation for what I would have earned if you hadn't stolen my idea and fired me. Public acknowledgement that the data management system was my creation, and funding for my children's education, all 3 of them, full scholarships through university, because the harm you did to me extends to them. They've grown up with less because of your theft. Marcus wrote everything down. I'll do all of that. And Jennifer, I want you to know, your idea was brilliant. It was one of the most innovative proposals I ever saw. You deserved recognition, success, everything that I took from you. But you took it anyway, Jennifer said. Because to you, I was just a resource to exploit. An administrative coordinator who couldn't possibly have ideas as valuable as the great Marcus Wellington. You're right, Marcus admitted. And I'm sorry. After Jennifer closed the door, Marcus sat in Grace's car with his head in his hands, trembling. Patricia sat in the back seat, making notes on the commitments Marcus had made. This is destroying me, Marcus said. Every conversation, every person whose life I ruined, I don't know how to carry this weight. You're not supposed to carry it easily, Grace said. That weight is the consequence of your choices. But Marcus, you're doing something important. You're not making excuses. You're not minimizing. You're actually listening and taking responsibility. Is it enough? For them? Maybe not, Grace said honestly. But for your own transformation, it's essential. Every genuine apology, every moment of real accountability is breaking down the walls of arrogance you built. That's painful, but it's also necessary. The remaining meetings followed similar patterns. Some people accepted Marcus's apologies with cautious hope. Others rejected them entirely, telling him that words were meaningless and no amount of repentance could undo what he'd done. One former employee, Rachel Kamani, literally spat at his feet and told him to get out of her life forever. By late afternoon, Marcus had met with 6 of the 7 people. He'd made financial commitments totaling millions of dollars, not to buy forgiveness, but to acknowledge the concrete harm he'd caused. He'd listened to stories of destroyed careers, broken families, psychological trauma. Each story was a mirror reflecting his cruelty with devastating clarity. The final meeting was with Michael Chen, the security analyst who'd tried to warn Marcus about Stephen Park's suspicious activities 3 years earlier. They met at a small park, sitting on a bench overlooking a playground where children played under their parents' watchful eyes. I checked on those access patterns you warned me about, Marcus said. You were right. Stephen had been setting up backdoor access to our systems for months. If I'd listened to you, none of this would have happened. Michael watched the children playing, his expression distant. I knew something was wrong. The patterns didn't make sense. But you told me I was paranoid, that I didn't understand executive-level operations. You made me doubt my own professional judgment. That was intentional, Marcus admitted. I'd rather make you question yourself than question Stephen, because questioning Stephen would have meant questioning my own judgment about who to trust. Do you know what happened after you fired me? Michael asked. I had a breakdown. Spent 2 months in therapy, trying to understand why I couldn't trust my own expertise anymore. You didn't just fire me. You made me doubt everything I knew about my profession. Marcus felt something breaking inside him. The psychological damage he'd caused went so far beyond financial harm. He'd undermined people's confidence, made them question their own competence, inflicted wounds that lasted years beyond the immediate crisis. I'm sorry, Marcus said. I destroyed your professional confidence to protect my ego and my flawed judgment. There's no excuse for that. No, there isn't, Michael agreed. But here's what I want you to understand. The damage you caused isn't just to individuals. You created a culture where people were afraid to speak truth, where questioning authority was punished, where sycophants thrived, and honest professionals were destroyed. That culture enabled Stephen Park to betray you. Your cruelty created the conditions for your own destruction. The words hit Marcus like a revelation. His downfall wasn't just bad luck or Dylan Foster's brilliance. It was the inevitable consequence of the toxic culture he'd created. He'd surrounded himself with people too afraid to challenge him, had driven away anyone with the integrity to question his decisions. In trying to protect himself from challenge, he'd made himself completely vulnerable. You're right, Marcus said. Everything that happened to me, I created through my own choices. As the sun began to set, Marcus sat with Grace and Patricia in a small diner, exhausted emotionally and physically. He'd faced 6 people he'd destroyed, and each meeting had stripped away another layer of the protective armor he'd built around his ego. Tomorrow is the last day, Patricia said quietly. Tomorrow night, Dylan releases his documentation. We've made progress, but Marcus, you need to understand something. The apologies you've made today don't erase what you did. They're just the beginning of a much longer journey. I know, Marcus said, and I'm starting to understand that maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't get to be forgiven quickly. Maybe carrying this weight is exactly what I need to become someone different. Grace smiled. Dorothy would be proud. You're starting to understand that redemption isn't about feeling better about yourself. It's about actually becoming better. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, his heart sinking at the words on the screen. I've been watching you apologize to people today. Interesting strategy. But words don't undo actions, Mr. Wellington. Tomorrow, the world sees who you really are. DF. Dylan Foster was monitoring him, watching his attempts at redemption. Marcus showed the message to Grace and Patricia. He's scared, Patricia said, reading the message. Your apologies threaten his narrative. He wants to expose a monster, but you're trying to become something else. That complicates his revenge story. What do I do? Exactly what you've been doing, Grace said. Keep being honest. Keep taking responsibility. And tomorrow, when Dylan releases his documentation, you face it with the same honesty you've shown today. No defensive statements, no PR spin. Just truth. That night, Marcus returned to his penthouse one last time. Tomorrow, it would likely be seized, sold off to pay debts and settlements. He walked through rooms that had represented his success, seeing them now as the empty monuments they'd always been. On his kitchen counter, he wrote a statement, not a press release crafted by professionals, but his own words, admitting what he'd done and accepting full responsibility. Tomorrow, when Dylan's documentation hit the media, Marcus would release this statement simultaneously. He would face his destruction not with lawyers and defenses, but with the truth. For the first time in his life, Marcus Wellington was choosing honesty over self-protection. The question was whether honest destruction could somehow lead to authentic rebuilding. The morning of the exposure arrived with deceptive calm. Marcus woke before dawn, knowing by evening his penthouse would belong to creditors, and he would likely belong to federal authorities. Instead of panic, he felt unexpected peace. At 6 a.m, Dylan Foster's documentation went live across every major news platform. Marcus watched as journalists dissected years of corporate abuse. Former employees gave tearful interviews. Legal experts predicted criminal charges. Video compilations showed him humiliating employees. Audio recordings captured unethical practices. documents proved systematic idea theft. It was devastating, comprehensive, undeniable, and Marcus had prepared by doing the one thing Dylan hadn't anticipated, agreeing with all of it. At 7 o'clock, Marcus released his statement. No lawyers, no PR team, just raw truth. My name is Marcus Wellington. Everything you're reading about me today is true. I built my company through theft, intimidation, and systematic abuse. I stole Dylan Foster's revolutionary idea. I fired Patricia Chen for questioning me. I destroyed Thomas Rivera's reputation. These are 3 names among dozens whose lives I damaged. I cannot undo what I've done, but I accept full responsibility for every action documented today. I will cooperate completely with all investigations. I will make financial restitution to every person I harmed. To Dylan Foster specifically, you were right about me. Everything you've exposed needed exposing. I hope your vindication brings you peace. The statement went viral immediately. News anchors debated whether it was genuine or calculated strategy, but curiosity emerged about what could cause such complete admission of guilt. Grace called it 8. Turn on Channel 7. Marcus saw Dylan Foster in a live interview, looking exhausted and haunted as the interviewer pressed him about Marcus's statement. Mr. Foster, Marcus Wellington admitted everything publicly. How does that feel? Dylan was silent. Empty. I wanted him to fight, to deny, to show the world his arrogance. But he just agreed. Made it impossible to position myself as the righteous whistleblower. Are you disappointed he admitted guilt? I spent years planning his destruction. But destroying someone who's already destroyed feels pointless. We have Patricia Chen on the line, the interviewer interrupted. Ms. Chen, can you speak to whether Marcus's apologies seem genuine? Patricia's voice came through clearly. The man who came to my classroom wasn't the Marcus Wellington I remembered. He listened without defending himself, took responsibility without excuses. That doesn't erase what he did, but it's more than I expected. Dylan struggled visibly. Patricia, he destroyed your career, because someone taught me that cycles of cruelty only end when someone chooses compassion over revenge, Patricia said firmly. Dorothy Jackson showed me redemption is possible. Marcus is doing that work. Marcus turned off the television. His phone exploded with messages, supportive, hostile, all wanting pieces of him. He turned it off and waited. The knock came at 9 o'clock. Dylan Foster stood in the hallway, rage and confusion mixing on his face. Why? Dylan demanded, pushing past Marcus. Why did you admit everything? You were supposed to fight. You were supposed to prove you're the monster I've been saying you are. Because I am that monster, Marcus said quietly. Fighting it would just add lies to existing crimes. This isn't how this was supposed to go, Dylan's voice broke. I spent years preparing to watch you deny and deflect, but you just agreed. You took away my vindication. I took away your enemy, Marcus corrected. You needed me to be the villain you could righteously destroy. Instead, I became someone who couldn't even give you the satisfaction of a fight. Dylan collapsed onto the sofa. Do you know what it was like? Watching you present my innovation as yours while I couldn't get hired anywhere. My career died because I trusted you. I know, Marcus said. Stephen told me years later what he'd done, bragged about protecting the company. I thought it was clever then. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back my career. No, it doesn't, Marcus agreed. But Dylan, what I did to you was inexcusable. But what you've become, someone who spent years planning revenge, that's not justice. That's more cruelty continuing the cycle. Don't you dare moralize to me. You started this cycle. You're right, I started it, and I'm trying to end it. But if you let what I did turn you into someone who finds satisfaction in destroying others, then I damaged you even more. I didn't just steal your idea. I stole your ability to move forward. Dylan stared, tears streaming. I don't know who I am without this revenge. I've spent so long being your victim that I don't remember who Dylan Foster wanted to be. Marcus felt his own tears starting. I remember. You were brilliant, passionate about innovation. You had ideas that could change industries. I killed that person. That's on me. So what now? Dylan asked hollowly. You go to prison, I get revenge, and we both live with emptiness. Or you reclaim the innovator you were supposed to become. Start your own company. I'll provide funding, not as payment, because money can't repay that debt, but as recognition that your ideas were always valuable. You think I'd take money from you? Before Marcus could respond, federal agents arrived with an arrest warrant. Grace and Patricia stood behind them. Marcus Wellington, you're under arrest for fraud and conspiracy, the lead agent said formally. I waive my rights, Marcus interrupted. I'll cooperate completely. Everything Dylan documented is accurate. I'll provide additional evidence. I just asked to finish this conversation first. The agents exchanged glances. This wasn't typical behavior. Marcus stood calmly, accepting handcuffs. Mr. Wellington, Grace stepped forward. Patricia and I wanted to witness this moment. To see me arrested? To see you transformed, Patricia corrected. The Marcus who built his empire would have fought with lawyers. You're accepting responsibility. That's not the same person who fired me. Dylan watched with confusion. Why are you helping him? He destroyed you both. He did, Grace agreed. But Dorothy Jackson taught us that breaking cycles is more important than perpetuating them. Marcus is taking that chance. Are you? I need to know, Dylan said finally. Stephen Park, where is he? He fled the country, an agent answered. We have warrants, but he's beyond jurisdiction. Probably spent years preparing his exit. Dylan went pale. He used me. All those years feeding me information, encouraging revenge. He was using me to destroy Marcus while he escaped. Stephen used everyone, Marcus said quietly. That's what I created. I taught him that using people was success. I'm sorry, Dylan. Sorry I created him. Sorry I hurt you. Something cracked in Dylan's expression. The righteous anger revealing the hurt young man underneath who'd just wanted his ideas to matter. As agents led Marcus toward the door, he stopped before Dylan. I can't give you back the years I stole, but I can give you permission to stop letting me define your life. You're brilliant, Dylan. Don't let what I did turn you bitter. Dorothy Jackson went to prison and came out helping hundreds. Maybe you can become someone who creates instead of destroys. Dylan said nothing, but Marcus saw the words landing. The arrest broadcast live on every network, but footage also emerged of Dylan breaking down, of Patricia speaking about Dorothy's philosophy, of community members noticing Marcus for the right reasons. In the months that followed, Marcus pled guilty to everything. He accepted years in federal prison. He liquidated assets to pay restitution, not court-ordered, but voluntary repayment to everyone on his 17-page list. Grace and Patricia started the Dorothy Jackson Foundation for Ethical Leadership, funded by Marcus's contribution. Dylan Foster launched an ethical cybersecurity startup, hiring several former employees who joined his revenge campaign. They chose creation over destruction. Thomas Rivera became Dylan's lead architect. Jennifer Okonkwo headed innovation, her name on every project. Michael Chen directed security protocols, and this time, people listened. Patricia became CEO of the foundation. Grace directed professional development at Riverside Community Center, connecting invisible people with opportunities. Marcus sat in federal prison, teaching business ethics to inmates, writing apology letters. Some returned unopened. Others received responses from forgiveness to anger. He accepted all of it. The letter that changed everything came 3 years into his sentence from Dylan Foster. Mr. Wellington, I'm writing to say something unexpected. Thank you. Not for what you did. That was inexcusable. But for what you did after. By admitting everything, you gave me permission to stop being your victim. My company is successful. We're building innovations ethically, creating culture where people are valued. But more importantly, I'm happy. You freed me by refusing to give me the fight I thought I needed. I won't say I forgive you. Maybe someday. But I believe you've changed. And knowing change is possible gives me hope for everyone. When you get out, there might be a role at my company. Not leadership, you forfeited that, but in ethics compliance. Your story has value because it's honest. Dylan Foster P.S. Stephen Park was arrested in Costa Rica. Karma isn't just a concept. Marcus cried reading it. Not because Dylan forgave him, but because Dylan was free. Years later, released from prison, Marcus took a modest job at the Dorothy Jackson Foundation, teaching ethics alongside Patricia. He lived near Riverside Community Center, volunteering weekends, often cleaning floors with Grace. On Dorothy's death anniversary, the foundation held remembrance. Marcus spoke briefly. I never met Dorothy Jackson, But her philosophy, carried by Grace and Patricia, gave me a chance I didn't deserve. She believed anyone could change, that cruelty was learned behavior that could be unlearned. I spent decades being cruel. I deserved everything that happened. But Dorothy's legacy offered me what I'd never offered others, a second chance. I'm still working on that transformation daily. If her philosophy could transform someone as far gone as I was, it can transform anyone. After the ceremony, a young man approached nervously. "Mr. Wellington, I'm Jeremy Santos. I have a software idea, but no credentials or funding. Everyone dismissed me. I heard your story and thought, maybe you'd understand being dismissed because of who you are rather than what you know." Marcus looked at this young man, ambitious, brilliant, vulnerable, and felt old instincts stirring. But he'd learned better ones. "Tell me about your idea," Marcus said. "And Jeremy, whatever you share stays yours. If it's good, I'll help you find funding, but your name stays on it. That's how this should work." Jeremy's eyes filled with tears. "Really? Someone once gave me a chance I didn't deserve," Marcus said, thinking of Grace, Patricia, and Dorothy's legacy. "The least I can do is give you the chance you actually do deserve." As they walked to discuss Jeremy's proposal, Marcus passed a window reflection and barely recognized himself. The arrogant CEO was gone, replaced by someone humbler, wiser, more human. He would never stop regretting what he'd done. The people hurt, lives damaged, years wasted. Those scars would never fully heal. But he'd learned what Dorothy knew. You don't have to be defined by your worst moments. Change is possible for anyone willing to do the daily work. Marcus Wellington had lost everything: empire, reputation, freedom, years. But in losing everything, he'd gained something more valuable, the chance to become someone worth being. And that, he finally understood, was the only success that actually mattered.